Do you feel it? David's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence of the room like a blade. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and unreadable, yet filled with something I couldn't, or maybe didn't want to, name. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Feel what? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. The air between us was charged, heavy with a tension I'd been trying to ignore all evening. But here, now, with just the two of us in the dimly lit living room, it was impossible to pretend it wasn't there. He took a step closer, the distance between us shrinking in a way that made my heart race. "You know what?" he said, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "It's been there all night. Hell, maybe longer." I glanced toward the kitchen, where Mark was still washing dishes, humming some tune I couldn't quite place. The sound of running water was a steady backdrop, a reminder of the life I'd built, the stability I'd clung to for nearly 20 years. And yet, here I was, standing in the middle of my living room, feeling as though the ground beneath me was shifting. "David, My voice trailed off as I searched for the right words, but they eluded me. How could he do this? How could he just say things like that, so casually, as if he wasn't unraveling everything I thought I knew? He didn't wait for me to finish. Instead, he took another step, and suddenly he was so close I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said, his voice barely audible now. "Tell me you don't feel it too." I couldn't. I wanted to, but the words wouldn't come. Because he wasn't wrong. I did feel it. I'd felt it all evening, every time our eyes met across the table, every time his hand brushed mine as he passed the salt, every time he laughed at one of Mark's jokes and I found myself staring a little too long. I'd felt it, and I'd tried to push it down, to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there. But now, standing here with him so close, it was impossible to deny. Impossible. It had started as an ordinary evening. Mark had suggested dinner with David, his best friend since college, and I'd agreed without thinking too much of it. David was a constant in our lives, a fixture at family gatherings, holidays, and the occasional impromptu dinner. He was part of the rhythm of our marriage, a familiar face that never seemed to change. But when he walked through the door that evening, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. He looked the same as always, tall, with his dark hair slightly messy, his usual easy smile as he greeted us. But there was something in the way he looked at me, something in the way his eyes lingered just a beat too long, that made my stomach twist in a way it hadn't in years. Dinner had been uneventful at first. I'd busied myself in the kitchen, preparing the meal while Mark and David talked in the living room. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced up, I caught David's eyes on me, his gaze intense and unreadable. It should have made me uncomfortable, but instead, it sent a shiver down my spine, a heat I hadn't felt in far too long. By the time we sat down to eat, the tension was palpable, though Mark seemed oblivious. David's words were casual, his manner relaxed, but his eyes told a different story. They kept finding mine, dark and searching, as if he was trying to pull something from me, something I wasn't sure I was ready to give. After dinner, we moved to the living room, the wine glasses still half full between us. Mark stretched out on the couch, his head resting against the back cushions as he talked about work, his voice a low, steady hum. But I couldn't focus on what he was saying. My attention was fixed on David, who sat across from me, his legs slightly apart, his elbows resting on his knees as he leaned forward. He looked different, more present, more alive than I'd ever seen him. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, his voice cutting through Mark's monologue. His eyes met mine, and I felt that same shiver run through me. "Everything okay?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just tired," I lied. "Long day." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving mine. "You're different, you know that?" he said after a moment. "More. I don't know. Awake." The comment caught me off guard, and I blinked at him, unsure how to respond. "Awake?" I echoed. He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, like you're actually here for once." I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he wasn't. There was something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me, that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. And it scared me. It scared me because I didn't know what it meant, and I didn't know what to do with it. Later, after Mark had gone to bed, I found myself sitting on the couch, staring at the empty fireplace as I tried to process the evening. David had left hours ago, but his words still echoed in my mind, his gaze still burned into my skin. "You're different. More awake." Was I? I didn't know. All I knew was that something had shifted, something I couldn't ignore. And as I sat there in the quiet of the living room, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The next day, Mark left early for a meeting, leaving me alone in the house. I tried to distract myself with chores, but my mind kept drifting back to David, to the way he'd looked at me, the things he'd said. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of madness, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. When the doorbell rang, I wasn't surprised to find him standing there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Can I come in?" I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He followed me into the living room, his presence filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. "I can't stop thinking about last night," he said finally, his voice breaking the silence. "About you." I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "David, My voice trailed off as I searched for the right words, but he didn't wait for me to finish. "I'm not trying to force anything," he said quickly, his eyes pleading. I can't pretend like nothing's happening. Not when I feel like this." I stared at him, my mind racing. "Feel like this." The words echoed in my mind, sending a jolt of something fear, excitement, through me. I didn't know what to say, what to do. All I knew was that I couldn't ignore the way my pulse quickened when he looked at me, the way my stomach fluttered when he spoke. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt a spark of electricity shoot through me. "Neither do I," he said softly. "But I think we owe it to ourselves to figure it out." I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest, and for the first time in years, I felt alive, awake. And I knew, in that moment, that nothing would ever be the same. Mark's footsteps echoed through the house as he returned late that night, his voice calling out a tired greeting. I was sitting on the couch, pretending to read, but my hands were shaking. David had left moments before, his goodbye lingering in the air like a storm brewing on the horizon. I could still feel the warmth of his hand on mine, the way his gaze had seared into me, leaving me breathless. "Hey," Mark said, dropping his keys on the table with a clatter. "Everything all right?" "Fine," I said quickly, too quickly. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "Just tired." He nodded, barely glancing at me as he sank into the armchair. "Long day. David still here?" "No, he left," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. The lie felt heavy on my tongue, but Mark didn't seem to notice. He was already flipping through the channels on the TV, his attention elsewhere. I stood up, my knees weak, and made my way to the kitchen. I needed space, air, something to clear my head. The cold water from the tap splashed against my face, but it did nothing to soothe the turmoil inside me. What am I doing? I thought, gripping the edge of the sink until my knuckles turned white. This isn't me. This isn't us. But the truth was, I didn't know what us was anymore. Mark and I had been together for so long, our lives intertwined in a comfortable, predictable rhythm. But lately, that rhythm felt more like a cage. And David. David was like a burst of color in a world that had turned gray without me even noticing. Days passed, each one dragging on as I tried to bury the feelings that threatened to consume me. Mark remained oblivious, his routine unchanged. He went to work, came home, and we fell into the same old patterns. But there was a restlessness in me now, a hunger that I couldn't ignore. And David, he was always there, just on the edges of my thoughts, his presence a constant ache. It was Saturday afternoon when it all came to a head. Mark had left for work, and I was alone in the house, or so I thought. The sound of the doorbell startled me, and when I opened it, there he was. David stood on the doorstep, his dark hair slightly disheveled, his piercing gaze fixed on me. "Hey," he said, his voice low and smooth. "Can I come in?" I hesitated, my hand gripping the doorframe. "Mark's not here." "I know," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I came to see you." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I considered shutting the door, putting an end to this before it went any further. But something stopped me. A part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, craved this. Craved him. I stepped aside, and he walked in, his presence filling the room in a way that made my skin tingle. We stood in the living room, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "We can't keep pretending," he said quietly. "You feel it too, don't you?" I looked away, my heart racing. "David, it's dangerous. We're—" "I know," he interrupted, stepping closer. "But that doesn't change how I feel." "How we feel?" His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to deny it, to push him away and retreat into the safety of my marriage. But the truth was, I couldn't. Not anymore. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice trembling. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my cheek, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I think we owe it to ourselves to figure it out." His touch was electric, sending waves of heat through me. I closed my eyes, letting out a shaky breath. "This is wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or is it just different?" I opened my eyes to find him looking at me with such intensity that it took my breath away. And in that moment, I couldn't think of anything else. Not Mark, not the life we'd built, not the consequences that awaited us if we took this step. All I could think about was the way he made me feel alive, wanted, seen. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, and I felt something inside me snap. It was like a dam breaking, all the pent-up emotions and desires rushing to the surface. My hands found their way to his chest, and I pulled him closer, deepening the kiss. It was reckless, foolish, and yet it felt more right than anything I'd done in years. When we finally broke apart, I was trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. David's eyes were dark with desire, his breathing ragged. "We can stop," he said, his voice rough. "If you want." But I didn't want to stop. Not now. Not when I finally felt like myself again. "Stay," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't need to be told twice. His hands cupped my face, his lips finding mine once more. The world around us faded away, leaving nothing but the two of us, lost in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. And as he led me to the couch, I knew that there was no turning back. This was the point of no return, and I was ready to embrace it. The couch was soft beneath me, but my body felt anything but. Every nerve was alive, every inch of me hyper-aware of David's presence, his warmth, his hands. His lips left mine for a moment, and I could feel his breath against my neck. Hot and unsteady. I shivered, my fingers digging into his shoulders as if I might float away if I didn't hold on tightly enough. "Are you sure?" he murmured, his voice low, almost a growl. His eyes searched mine, dark and unreadable, full of something that made my stomach twist in the most delicious way. I didn't answer with words. Instead, I pulled him closer, my lips crashing into his with a desperation I hadn't realized I was capable of. "Yes," I thought, "yes, I'm sure." But even as the thought crossed my mind, a tiny voice in the back of my head whispered warnings, reminders of the life I was risking, the stability I was throwing away. I pushed it aside. This wasn't the time for doubt. This was the time for feeling, for living, for finally giving into something I'd been denying myself for far too long. David's hands moved slowly, deliberately, as if he were savoring every moment. His fingers traced the curve of my shoulder, the slope of my neck, before slipping beneath the fabric of my shirt. The touch sent a jolt through me, and I gasped, arching into him. How long has it been since someone touched me like this? The thought was fleeting, quickly drowned out by the sensations coursing through me. He pulled back slightly, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice rough, almost reverent. The words caught me off guard, and I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. It wasn't just the compliment, it was the way he said it, as if he truly believed it, as if he saw something in me that I hadn't seen in myself in years. I didn't know how to respond, so I kissed him instead, my hands moving to the buttons of his shirt. My fingers fumbled, clumsy with urgency, but he didn't seem to mind. When the fabric finally parted, I trailed my hands over his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady beat of his heart. He was solid, real, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive. His hands found the hem of my shirt, and I lifted my arms, letting him pull it over my head. The air was cool against my bare skin, but the heat of his gaze more than made up for it. He looked at me as if I were something precious, something to be cherished, and it was almost too much. How can he look at me like that? I wondered, a lump forming in my throat. But before I could dwell on it, his lips were on mine again, and I was lost. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the two of us, the feel of his skin against mine, the sound of our breaths mingling in the quiet room. Every touch, every movement, felt like a revelation, like something I'd been waiting for without even realizing it. And as his hands explored my body, I realized that I'd been starving for this, for connection, for passion, for something that went beyond the comfort and routine of my life with Mark. But even as I reveled in the moment, a part of me couldn't help but think about him. About Mark, my husband, the man who had been my rock for nearly 2 decades. The guilt was there, lurking in the back of my mind, but it was dulled by the intensity of the moment, by the way David made me feel. Is this wrong? I wondered briefly, but the thought was quickly pushed aside. I couldn't think about that now. Not when David's hands were doing things that made my mind go blank, when his lips were claiming every inch of me as if he couldn't get enough. He shifted, his body pressing against mine, and I felt the weight of him, the strength. It was intoxicating, and I found myself craving more, wanting to feel every part of him. My hands moved to his belt, clumsily unbuckling it, and he let out a low growl that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're driving me crazy," he murmured, his voice thick with desire. The words sent a thrill through me, and I smiled against his lips. "Good," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I want to." He let out a groan, his hands tightening on my waist as he pulled me closer. And then we were moving, shifting, until I was beneath him, the weight of him pressing me into the couch. His lips found mine again, and I melted into him, my body responding to his every touch, every caress. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. And I surrendered completely, letting myself be consumed by the moment. But even as I lost myself in the sensations, a tiny part of me couldn't help but wonder what would happen after. What would this mean for us? For me? For Mark? The guilt threatened to surface again, but I pushed it down, refusing to let it ruin this. This was mine, my moment, my choice, and I wasn't ready to let it go. David's lips traveled down my neck, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. I tilted my head back, giving him better access, and he took full advantage. His hands were everywhere, exploring, claiming, and I couldn't help but respond, my own hands moving over his body with a desperation that surprised me. It was as if we were trying to make up for lost time, trying to bridge the gap that had been growing between us for years. And then he stopped, just for a moment. He looked at me, his eyes dark with need, and I could see the question in them. "Are you sure?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, just for a second, but then I nodded. "Yes," I thought. "Yes, I'm sure." And as he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, I realized that I meant it. I was ready. Ready for this. Ready for him. And whatever came next, I would face it. But not now. Now, there was only this. Only us. His lips were soft, yet demanding, and I could feel the weight of his body pressing into mine. The warmth of his skin against my bare chest sent shivers down my spine, and I found myself arching into him, wanting more. His hands roamed over my body, leaving a trail of heat wherever they touched, and I couldn't help but gasp as his fingers traced the curve of my waist, sliding lower, teasing, tantalizing. "You're so beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with desire, and I felt a flush of heat rise to my cheeks. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me with such hunger, such need. It made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. "What are we doing?" A small voice in the back of my mind whispered, but I silenced it, pushing it down, refusing to let it ruin this moment. This was mine. Mine to take, mine to feel. And right now, I didn't care about the consequences. David's lips moved lower, trailing kisses down my neck, my collarbone, and I gasped as he took one of my breasts into his mouth, his tongue circling the sensitive flesh. My hands tangled in his hair, holding him there, and I could feel the heat building inside me, a fire that threatened to consume me whole. But then, he stopped. Just for a moment. He looked up at me, his eyes dark with need, and I could see the question in them. "Are you sure?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, just for a second, but then I nodded. "Yes," I thought. "Yes, I'm sure." And as he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, I realized that I meant it. I was ready. Ready for this. Ready for him. And whatever came next, I would face it. But not now. Now, there was only this. Only us. He shifted his weight, positioning himself between my legs, and I could feel the hardness of him pressing against me, sending a jolt of electricity through my body. I gripped his shoulders, my nails digging into his skin, and he let out a low groan. "You're so wet," he whispered, his voice thick with need, and I could feel my cheeks flush at his words. I hadn't felt like this in years, so full of desire, so lost in the moment. And when he finally slid into me, I let out a gasp, my body trembling with the intensity of it. He moved slowly at first, his eyes locked on mine, and I could see the hunger in them, the need. And then he began to move faster, his pace increasing, and I could feel the heat building inside me, a fire that threatened to consume me whole. My hands gripped his shoulders, my nails digging into his skin, and he let out a low groan, his hips thrusting into me with a rhythm that made my head spin. "You feel so good," he whispered, his voice thick with desire, and I could feel my body responding to his words, to his touch. I arched into him, wanting more, needing more, and he obliged, his hands moving to my hips, pulling me closer, deeper. The room was filled with the sound of our breathing, quick and shallow, and the feel of his body against mine, the heat of him, the way he moved inside me, was everything. I could feel the tension building inside me, a coiled spring ready to snap, and I gasped, my body trembling with the intensity of it. "David," I whispered, my voice trembling, and he looked at me, his eyes dark with need, and I could see the question in them. "I'm close," I murmured, and he nodded, his pace increasing, his thrusts becoming harder, more urgent. "Let go," he whispered, his voice thick with desire, and I did. I let go, my body trembling with the force of it, and I cried out, my hands gripping his shoulders tightly as the wave of pleasure washed over me. And then he was there with me, his body shuddering as he reached his own release, and I could hear the low groan that escaped his lips as his grip on me tightened. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our breathing, quick and shallow, and the feel of his body against mine. And then, slowly, he pulled away, his eyes still locked on mine, and I could see the question in them. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know. I didn't have an answer to that question. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. This had changed everything. And now I had to figure out what that meant. For me. For Mark. For us. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling, and he nodded, his eyes still locked on mine, and I could see the uncertainty in them. "But we'll figure it out," I added, my voice firm, and he nodded again, his eyes still locked on mine, and I could see the resolve in them. "Together," he whispered, his voice barely above a whisper, and I nodded, my eyes still locked on his, and I could see the determination in them. Together. We'd figure this out. Together. But for now, there was only this moment. This feeling. This connection that we'd forged in the heat of passion. And as he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, I realized that I didn't want to let this go. Not yet. Not ever. But I knew that we'd have to face the consequences of what we'd done. And soon. But for now, there was only this. Only us. And that was enough.